right, I have the gracious opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Davis, who is an American process philosopher, theologian, and scholar of the cosmological wonder. He is program director for the Center for Process Studies, where he researches, writes, and organizes conferences on various aspects of process relational thought. An advocate of metaphysics and meaning in a hospitable universe, Andrew approaches philosophy as the endeavor to systematically think through what reality must be like because we are part of it. He is an author, editor, and co-editor of several books, including Mind, Value, and Cosmos on the Relational Nature of Ultimacy, which was nominated for the International Society of Science and Religion's 2022 Book Prize, and most recently, a really wonderful book called The Metaphysics of Exo-Life, Toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmo-Theology. This afternoon, he will speak to us on metaphysics beyond Earth, Whitehead, Teilhard, and the emergence of process exo-theology. Andrew.
All right, thank you, Ilya. Okay, well, as Ilya mentioned, the title of the talk is Metaphysics Beyond Earth, Whitehead, Teilhard, and the Emergence of Process Philosophical Exo-Theology. I highlight that term emergence because in the last few years, I've taken it as a sort of personal attempt to look at process thinking, the ways in which it can be relevant to this discussion, Whitehead, Teilhard, others, in a way that is making up for a certain neglect that we've witnessed in the current literature. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the relevance of Whitehead and Teilhard to this larger discussion. I point first to a series of texts just to make a point that even in the last 5 years in this top row, but extending back even the last 20 years, the whole explosion of literature that's angling certain responses philosophically, theologically to the question of other worlds and extraterrestrial life. Its implications, its justifications. It's really a fantastic bit of literature that's on the rise. Of course, this is an ancient discussion. And what you notice when you go in deep to this literature is there's a certain neglect that is suffered by the resources of process thought. It's not an absolute neglect. There's more mention of Teilhard, certainly, than Whitehead, no doubt, because he said much more on the topic. But there has not been, until recently, any sustained treatment of the topic from within the resources of process thinking. So that bugs me. So it's a fascinating topic. So what I've aimed to do in the last couple of years is contribute to this discussion. The book that Ilya mentioned, Metaphysics of Exo-Life, Toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmo-Theology, is my recent contribution. It's a constructive philosophical critique of the naturalistic cosmo-theology of Stephen J. Dick, who is NASA's former chief historian. It critiques Dick's work, deepens Dick's work from within the metaphysics of Whitehead. Be interested to see what you think of that book. It's just out here on the table as well as on Amazon. Perhaps most importantly is a forthcoming text. This is just a mock-up of the potential cover. Astrophilosophy, Exo-Theology, and Cosmic Religion, Extraterrestrial Life in a Process Universe. And this is a series of essays and papers that have emerged from the event that Ilya mentioned yesterday in May of 2022, where we tackled a variety of levels from astrobiology to theology, metaphysics, and religion from various perspectives within process thought. So Bergson, Teilhard, Whitehead, and a number of different contributions. So that's just to say, look out for this text. We're making contributions to this conversation, and it's quite interesting, to be sure. Whitehead and Teilhard, I have the feeling that they often looked at the stars. This is an AI-generated photo, which I think is quite cool. You'll notice that Whitehead's complexion is a bit smoother, and I think the reason for that is he spent less time in the dirt than Teilhard, less time in, literally in the dirt. We were joking yesterday at dinner that perhaps we should have Teilhard's face looking down to sort of ditto this Aristotelian Platonic kind of dimension. So Teilhard did look down quite a bit, but Lord knows he also looked up. We're going to see some of the statements to that effect. And so what I want to ask with you today is, what is the reach and the relevance of Whitehead and Teilhard to the topic? Now, certainly a lot can and should be said. I say more in the paper. What I'm going to do here today is just highlight in a comparative fashion some of the resonant dimensions, I'd say, of their thought for the development of a process philosophical exo-theology. Okay, there's a number of ways we could do that. I'm going to focus on four. Okay, the historical dimension, anthropological dimension, the philosophical dimension, and the theological as well. So let's jump in first to the historical under a theme that I'm calling simply cosmology and theology in transit or transition. Okay, so we've seen already that Whitehead and Teilhard write in this midst of a shifting cosmological landscape, really the implications of which are bewildering in many ways for science, philosophy, and theology alike. Okay, we've seen that this shift in cosmological thinking is linked inexorably in a deep way to the rise of evolutionary cosmology against these formerly static notions of the universe. Okay, both show a keen sensitivity to new cosmological discoveries, okay, whether what the new telescopes are revealing, new planets, as Whitehead mentions, new stellar systems, as Teilhard notes. In fact, I'd even say that Teilhard shows more of a keen sensitivity than Whitehead to these advances and what they mean for our kind of thinking. They both share criticisms, what we might say is a historical hostility to certain dimensions of the church, certainly not just the church, and hostility towards new scientific innovations. So they comment at length on the Galileo affair. Whitehead mentions Bruno as the martyr of speculative imagination, and Bruno, we'll recall, did hold to the infinite reality of worlds, populated worlds. Things didn't end well for him, as Matt insinuated. I asked Ilya and Don about whether or not Teilhard's censorship had anything to do with his affirmation of a plurality of thinking worlds. It sounds like it was less the case, but interesting to wonder about. Okay, both men insist that we have to existentially face the fact of our cosmological decentering. And not just that, but the likelihood that there is a life beyond Earth of all different kinds and stripes. We're going to see a few statements to that effect. And both also push terrestrial philosophy and theology to incorporate these facts, to incorporate the possibility, the fact of our cosmological decentering, the possibility, I think, certainly of life beyond Earth. So for Whitehead, we are small and we're likely not alone. So consider his statement. He says, the human race consists of a small group of animals which for a small time has barely differentiated itself from the mass of animal life living on a small planet circling around a small sun. By contrast, the universe is vast. Okay, his wonder extends from Earth to beyond Earth, and who that watches the heavens can doubt that forms of life just as amazing exist on other planets. Now, Teilhard, similarly, life is not centered at us. He says, we know with absolute physical certainty that the stellar universe is not centered on the Earth, and that terrestrial life is not centered on mankind. So neither from a cosmic perspective would life be centered on mankind for Teilhard, similar to Whitehead. He says it's almost impossible to conceive that among the millions of the Milky Ways which whirl in space, there's not one which has known or is going to know conscious life. And for Teilhard, there's likely far more than one. So we'll see that too. So both men, as I mentioned, we must take account of this cosmological decentering. Philosophy and theology must take account of this fact in the likelihood of extraterrestrial life. So Whitehead, for example, says, any system of thought that's based on this earth of ours is extremely limited in its conceptions, either theology or philosophy, and most of them have been. So we take account of this cosmological decentering, then he points to us. The response to that knowledge of first-rate people, philosophers, theologians, talking together, thinking this is people like you and I, should be immeasurably larger than it is. It's almost as if he's saying, have we have not yet approached the magnitudes that surround us. Have we really incorporated that into our worldviews? I think of the James Webb Space Telescope and those images that are being revealed. I think of Whitehead's quotes here. Now, more so than Whitehead, Teilhard's involved in this conversation theologically, at a theological level. Notice he says, confronted with this fantastic multiplicity of astral centers, how is theology going to react? There is no question, he says, of having to begin work on a theology for these unknown worlds. So this we can read immediately as a call for the development of a form of process exo-theology. And it's noteworthy that in the current literature, these are the questions they're raising right now. Teilhard was, again, ahead of his time on this call for a theology and incorporate this fundamental question. So we can make our classical theology open or at least blossom into a positive possibility, he says, of there existence and their presence. Now, Teilhard is not just involved theologically, he's actually angered with the theologians. Don sort of gave us a hint of that a little bit. He's mad that a lot of theologians, theology at his time, are essentially shutting their eyes to what the astronomers are saying. And I quote this at length just because it's somewhat comedic. He says, "How, I repeat, is it that the theologians of the church cannot see that under these conditions, the plurality of inhabited worlds has once and for all ceased to be an imagination, and that from now on it is a greater probability which the Christian Weltanschauung must satisfy? On this point, as on many others, the theologians are serenely sitting on top of a volcano, or over an abyss which they do not see because they refuse to admit that 2 and 2 make 4, even in the favorable cases where they're capable of counting up to 2. I'm completely done with the theologians. Now, thanks to Don for that quote. He enlightened me to that, and he'll tell you, as he mentioned in his talk, this is a charitable translation. I'm completely done with the theologians. So I'll let you think of what he really said. Now, for both Teilhard and Whitehead, it's important to emphasize something. The other side of our cosmological decentering is not some obviously nihilistic and purposeless universe. Okay, I'm sort of elbowing deGrasse Tyson here, for example. The Copernican principle decentered us, and now we're meaningless, and it's all pointless, and the universe doesn't care. Those perspectives can be challenged. Okay, although it is existentially impactful, I would suggest that both for Whitehead and Teilhard, incorporating this fact is more about a stimulus to develop terrestrial worldviews. Okay, our understanding of ourselves anthropologically, our understanding of the nature and character of things philosophically, and our understanding of the cosmic nature and function of God theologically. So both men would insist that our cosmological decentering is a significant part, say, of our cosmological story, but it's not the most significant part. Okay, and that's, I think, an important dimension. Well, why not? Let's turn to the anthropological under the theme, or a transition I'm calling, from anthropocentrism to anthropocosmism. So we've seen in previous presentations that both men offer strong critiques, scientifically, philosophically, theologically, against those who would bifurcate or abstract human beings from their rightful standing in and as nature. Okay, we can say expressions and not deviations of what the universe is ultimately up to, and that is at the ground of their beginning to think about nature of reality, beginning to think about the human position. Put differently, as I often like to put it, that we are exemplifications rather than exceptions to everything that's going on is at the heart of their methodological starting point. So what this allows us to say is that despite the reality of our cosmological decentering, the necessity of our metaphysical recentering is needed if we're going to endeavor to pierce, arguably, the deepest nature and character of reality, arguably from terrestrial to extraterrestrial to divine kind of spheres. So these conceptions for both of them, however, are not narrow repetitions of anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism. Arguably, they affirm human beings as anthropocosmic. That is, our experience as a part of nature is revelatory in some deep sense of the deeper rhymes and rhythms of evolutionary cosmology. Okay? That would be the case on this planet, and arguably, as ontology dictates, also beyond it. So for Whitehead, Teilhard, we are fully natural. In a deep sense, this is part of our grandeur. He says the preeminent significance of man in nature and the organic nature of mankind, these are two assumptions that you can try to get rid of. But if you do, essentially, he says, we have no place to start when thinking about mankind, and by extension, in thinking about the universe. He says we represent individually, socially, the most synthesized state under which the stuff of the universe is available, and we're the most mobile point of the stuff in the course of transformation. Similarly, for Whitehead, we are fact within nature. He says any doctrine which refuses to place human experience outside nature must therefore find in descriptions of human experience factors which also enter into the descriptions of less specialized natural occurrences. And if there's no such occurrences, then this notion that we're a part of nature is mere bluff, he says. Of course, for him, it's not mere bluff. Okay, he pushes us. Mankind's gradually developed from the lowliest forms of life and must therefore be explainable in terms applicable to all such forms. And then he asks, but why do we construe the latter forms by analogy to the earlier forms? Why not reverse the process? It seemed more sensible, more truly empirical, right, to allow each living species to contribute to this endeavor. We see him in many places resisting this unilateral reading of nature, from nature out there to the human, instead of from nature in here to nature beyond us, right? He's calling for this reciprocal notion. It's double-edged. Our methodology needs to be double-edged. So despite our cosmological decentering, the fact that we're part of nature, the fact that we have to be metaphysically recentered to even begin an endeavor to think about the universe offers a sense of reintegration or belonging, I'd argue, for the human place in nature. So Teilhard, in such a vision, man is not seen as the static center of the world, as he long believed himself to be, but as the axis leading the chute of evolution, which is something much finer. Whitehead, the nature of things are disclosed in our immediate experience. In being ourselves, we are more than ourselves, to know that our experience, dim and fragmentary as it is, yet sounds the utmost depths of reality. A beautiful statement, poetic statement, a sense of belonging when I read this, certainly. Now, what are these utmost depths of the universe? What is the stuff of the universe as expressed in human experience? And what we should ask are the implications beyond Earth. Okay, so let's turn to the philosophical domain. And the theme here is what I'm calling retrospective ontology for evolutionary cosmology. So both Whitehead and Teilhard, as we've just noted, say we can look nowhere else than to human experience in trying to discern or pierce what the ontological constituents of reality are, what they're like. Okay, and for both of them, I argue this involves a certain method that I call retrospective induction. Okay, that is this imaginative endeavor to descend downward from human experience, through layers of reality, to see, at least in part, what they may be like at the most fundamental. So for both men, this method is based arguably in a conviction as to the metaphysical uniformity or continuity of nature, which is in principle cosmologically expressed throughout the cosmos in a deep sense. We've seen that they both have atomic and active ontologies that are living and not obviously dead. And that's going to be an important distinction when we think about exo-life, when we think about life in the universe. In fact, I would argue that for both of them, life, mind, and value are ontological primitives, and therefore the ingredients of cosmic evolution. And this is no small claim, because what it means is that there is no meaning to evolution then, beyond the higher complexification, intensification of life, mind, and value. And if you see the implications for exo-life here already, good for you. The fact that these arguably ontological domains have found expression on our planet arguably necessitates their emergence beyond it in some way. So let's look at each of these briefly then. Life first. So Whitehead and Teilhard both breathe life back into ontology. A part of this is they both reject, Whitehead says here, an absolute gap between living and non-living organic systems. Teilhard says, go in with a microscope. There is no absolute zero, absolute fixed time for the advent of life. They both find life all the way down in nature, arguably. The root principles, says Whitehead, are in some lowly form exemplified in all types of physical existence. So too, Teilhard, life assumes a pre-life for as far back as the eye can see. But again, pre-life does not mean lifeless. Pre-life is not death. Okay, very important. Now, Whitehead's organisms, the fundamental organisms of his ontology, are living events, I would argue, and argue that the livingness of these events are connected to their temporal dynamics, the fact that they're becoming into being. They're related to every other perspective in this universe. And Whitehead says this actually explicitly in Modes of Thought, which Matt was quoting earlier, that the base of his ontology, these actual entities, show the characteristics of life. He says absolute self-enjoyment, creative activity, and aim. Okay, now Teilhard too insists that that duration, similar to becoming, right, this Bergsonian notion, duration is a part of the fabric of being, and that every particle is not some isolated bit, but threads back in a process that is infinite. And can we say the process is living itself? Well, in a sense we can. Teilhard says life is not an epiphenomenon of the material universe, but the central phenomenon. Life is a universal function of the cosmos. So let's ask then, okay, what are the implications of such a living ontology beyond Earth? It's not quite a trick question. Okay, Teilhard insists that we're going to have no idea of the chemistry or morphology particular to various extraterrestrial forms of life, and yet at an average of at least one human race or extraterrestrial mankind per galaxy, that makes a total of millions of human races dotted across the heavens. Okay, note he's not talking about human race as a human race on this planet. It's a hominized species, psychic reflected life. Okay, we're going to get to mind in just a moment. But millions dotted over the heavens. If there's even two per galaxy, we're pushing billions. Right? Note Whitehead too. Okay, the forms of life which might be lived on other stars millions of light years away and million hence could be infinite and admit every possibility that the imagination could conceive. Whitehead haunted by these infinite possibilities. So, Teilhard and Whitehead breathe life back into ontology. Okay, we're going to see now that they also infuse mind back into ontology. So for Whitehead, as we know, the final facts are all alike. They're entities, they're drops of experience that have a mental pull. Teilhard insists we're part of nature. Logically, we're forced to assume in some rudimentary form or infinitely diffuse state some sort of psyche in every corpuscle. Okay, Whitehead's is a pan-experientialism, right, where experience is the ontological primitive. Consciousness is a high evolutionary achievement later in evolution, but its base is experiential. Teilhard, we might say, is a panpsychist. Okay, consciousness is an ontological primitive, although he uses the language of consciousness in an important sense, and he makes this distinction that it indicates every kind of psychism, okay, from the most rudimentary all the way up. So this is an important distinction. The critique that's often leveraged at panpsych is, oh, well, they all just think everything's conscious. Well, it's more nuanced than that. It's much more complicated than that. So arguably, I think I would agree, Godehard, that maybe Teilhard is a pan-experientialist in this sense. Consciousness, human consciousness doesn't go all the way down, right? This is a mistake to say that. It's a descent. Okay, we see dipolarity in Whitehead's actual occasions, a physical pole, a mental pole, exteriority and interiority that belong together. Similarly, efficient and final causation belong together in this sweep of process. And similarly, in the dual aspect monism of Teilhard, he says mind and matter are the two aspects or connected parts of one and the same phenomenon. Exteriority and interiority ascend together, tangential and this physical energy and radial, this interior centrating energy also belong together. What I'd like clarity on, maybe from the Teilhardians, tangential and radial, is this efficient and final causation in some sense? What's the relationship between those? I see Elia shaking her head, so maybe at the question or time. All right, however far Whitehead says efficient causality is pushed, there always remains the slice of self-determination. It's freedom, okay? There's freedom in Whitehead's universe, similar to Teilhard, okay? Determinate without, but also free within, okay? Arguably even at the lowest levels of nature. Let's ask again, what are the implications of pan-experientialist or panpsychist ontology beyond Earth? Now I show Hartshorne here orbiting the planet because early on Hartshorne recognized that a panpsychist or pan-experientialist view, pardon the overlap there, implies the eternal existence of finite minds of some kind in the universe. And he adds to this, of the many ways it might be verified, one would be by the discovery of other inhabited planets, right? If mind is in your ontology, then mind obtains beyond Earth. What about Teilhard? Our minds cannot resist the inevitable conclusion that were we by chance to possess plates that were sensitive to the specific radiation of the new spheres scattered throughout space, it'd be practically certain that what we saw registered on them would be a cloud of thinking stars. A great statement. Okay, I won't read all this, but Whitehead says, there's no reason to suppose that the air about us and the heavenly spaces over us may not be peopled by intelligences or entities or forms of life as unintelligible to us as we are to the insects, right? He speculates here that even the nebula could be sentient entities. What we're seeing of them are their bodies. Okay, but I point you to his last sentence. My point is that we're part of an infinite series, and since the series is infinite, we'd better take account of the fact and admit into our thinking these infinite possibilities, right? Infinite possibilities again. Well, what are some of these possibilities? Again, Teilhard thinks about these more than Whitehead. Could we make contact? Again, I won't read all of this. Teilhard speculates that we should expect the unexpected. We might be able to free ourselves from the prison of Earth and inhabit other planets, is what he says here. And not just that, but potentially come into psychic contact with other centers of consciousness, other new spheres scattered across the universe. And he says still a more giddy perspective. He's giddily saying this. Unfortunately, he descends from his giddiness and says, well, it's all really unlikely. Why is it unlikely? We face two bottlenecks, okay? A terrestrial bottleneck. We are woven from the earth. And it's not so easy that that can just be translated somewhere else. And spatial bottlenecks. It's inconceivably vast out there, and the notion that our biological species could make that journey and survive it seems difficult. Thus, he descends from the giddiness and says, we're going to fold in on our own Earth. We're going to develop interior in a psychic direction rather than a spatial direction. So he makes a lot of interesting statements about potential space travel. Maybe Elaine will comment on that further as we go on. So Whitehead and Teilhard breathe life back into ontology. They infuse mind back into ontology. They also reawaken value in ontology. So Whitehead says, we shall never elaborate an explanatory metaphysics unless we abolish this notion of valueless, vacuous existence. So for him, to exist in experience is to value. All experience is value experience, right? So this claim that Whitehead is a pan-experientialist should be followed along with the claim that, as Victor Lowe called him, a pan-valuist as well, that pan-experientialism is a pan-axiological view of nature. Those are not always equated, but I do think they should be. So actual occasions, as these slices of life and experience, are not valueless for Whitehead. They're something intrinsically valuable, something in and for themselves. And he says the world bears witness to the becomingness of real values. Moreover, that existence in its own nature is the upholding of value intensity. Value is what's being achieved in the course of cosmic evolution. So this process can be seen fundamentally for him as a value process. It presupposes real standards of value, whether harmony, truth, beauty, intensity, etc., which are in the nature of things, okay, as well as also possibilities of achievable value, right? In some sense, are hibernating in the nature of things, waiting to be realized. Now, Teilhard, I think we can draw similarities here. He says the infinite value of the universe and its inexhaustible storehouse of richness. What is inexhaustible? Well, something like possibility and value. He doesn't make statements precisely like Whitehead from what I've read, but it would seem that that makes sense. He speaks of the value of sacred evolution as this instrument or process of beatification, right? That in principle goes all the way down, that even at the fundamental base of ontology is this process of beatification happening. Speaks of the direction and speed of evolution as being oriented towards absolute values. What are those values? Love, certainly, we'll get to that. Perhaps truth, beauty, goodness, others. Okay, and he draws a connection between the degree of complexity and the degree of value. That where complexity rises, value also rises. Or similarly, he speaks of the qualitative value which is expressed with the appearance of a new state of consciousness, right? A arguably coherent relationship between the rise of consciousness and the rise of value. Now, what about morality? For both thinkers, morality is an evolutionary phenomenon. Whitehead insists that the moral order is merely certain aspects of the aesthetic order. Okay, we might say that just as consciousness crowns experience at higher evolutionary levels, so too does morality crown aesthetics. Okay, he insists that, for example, there's that other form of beauty which is rightness of conduct, which has emerged in the evolutionary process. Although, like Teilhard, he is resisting of certain codifications of morality. He stresses that we've exaggerated these quite a bit at times. And nevertheless, moral progress is a reality which we've seen achieved over the slow sunrise of 1,000 years, right? This moral progress, this arc that is developing slowly. I think it can be said for Teilhard that morality too dawns with the advent of higher consciousness. Okay, and there's several statements he makes. That the growing coextension of our soul through our conscious relationship to all things is an organic process and expresses itself here in the moral value of our actions. Or the fact that the initial basis of our obligation is linked to this cosmic current of which we are a part. He says duty in its origins is nothing but the reflection of the universe in the atom. Right? That's a great statement. Challenging, though. Is there a sense of duty that goes all the way down in nature, all the way to the level of ontology? It wouldn't be a moral duty or an ethical duty per se. Perhaps it's an aesthetic duty. So I'm seeking clarity on where the aesthetic value lies in Teilhard's ontology. What are the implications then of an evolutionary morality beyond Earth. There's no simple solution here. Teilhard says even morality on Earth is a painful spectacle of confusion. And he's almost voicing the question of his critics, saying, can we even maintain that good and evil exist in evolution as long as evolution has no direction, has no purpose? Of course, he does think it has a purpose. At the bottom here, life has an objective. That objective is a summit, arguably a moral summit, which integrates individuals, society, nations, races, etc. Okay? Perhaps there's another planet that's doing better with respect to this call. Okay? Whitehead's skeptical as well. He says there's many perfections. Each society has to put up with certain blots on their moral record. And note his statement, the notion that there are certain regulative notions sufficiently precise to prescribe details of conduct for all reasonable beings on Earth, in every planet, and in every star system is at once to be put aside. That's the notion of the one perfection at which the universe aims. But he says all realization of the good is finite and necessarily excludes different types. There might be distinctions between Whitehead and Teilhard here. Is Teilhard saying there's one perfection to which we're moving? I'm not sure. Whitehead says there's not. So this aim at social perfection, embodied in these moral codes, Whitehead thinks is quite important. We're haunted by perfection. He says it's not just a romance of thought. It's a fact of nature. So let's contextualize this then theologically, right? What sort of theological model do we embed this ontology of life, mind, and value in? So I think as we've seen already, God as beginning and end, Alpha and Omega, is a way of characterizing both Whitehead and Teilhard's thought, although there's nuances, certainly. So we've seen already both a dynamic and participatory view of God that aims to complement rather than contradict what it is we see in the evolutionary process. Okay. They also critique static and non-relational metaphysical categories that would make the world superfluous to God, which would make them, God and the world, essentially the great antithesis of each other. Okay, for both, the cosmic process is organic and interior, such that God and the world show a deep and dynamic union with one another, a point that's been emphasized. God only creates through evolution. And this requires us, for both, to rethink omnipotence, to rethink evil as being this inherent shadow side of an evolutionary process. Okay? And finally, as Matt was emphasizing, we have a divine dipolarity, arguably, on the one hand, that God is the ground of possibility and value, presupposed by the evolutionary process, in some sense, the primordial or alpha dimension of God. And God is also its fulfillment and final transformation, right? This consequent or omega dimension. Okay, but again, there's important nuances here. There's a character in the nature of things in evolution that we'll see expressed by both of them. And, okay. So let me just comment on a few of those. So against the metaphysics of being, or pure being, or pure act. So Teilhard says, ever since Aristotle, there's this continual attempt to construct models of God as a prime mover a retro, that is, from behind, from the past. Okay, he says, in the metaphysics of being, pure act, once posited, monopolizes all that is absolute and necessary in being. Nothing can justify the existence of participated being. So deduced from this metaphysics of potency and act, creation is gratuitous, it's superfluous in a way, and it was based in this Thomistic framework of a static universe. Okay, Whitehead, too, points to this disastrous combination between Aristotle's unmoved mover on the one hand and the Christian doctrine of God as eminently real. He says it gave birth to an aboriginal, eminently real, transcendent creator at whose fiat the world came into being and whose will it is obeying. He calls it a fallacy. Similarly, God became this one absolute, omnipotent, omniscient source of all being for his own existence, requiring no relations beyond himself. God became the ultimate substance. And Teilhard says, since the emergence in our consciousness of evolution, it's impossible now to conceive anything but an organic prime mover, God ab ante, right? Up ahead, into the future. Similarly, the created world, back to Teilhard, is useless, superfluous on the plane of being, and what becomes essential is the plane of union, right? And I note Whitehead's comparison here, that what metaphysics requires is the solution which exhibits the world as requiring its union with God, and God as requiring its union with the world. Okay, I'll comment a little bit on divine dipolarity. So we see Teilhard speaking of a pole to the universe, which is supreme in attraction, which he calls omega. But as we've encountered several times already, it's not just a future thing. Okay, it's already in existence and operative, presumably as this alpha, immersed in existence, leading evolution. He uses the language of control here, but it's certainly not an absolute control. Okay, he on the one hand says God is self-sufficient, and yet the universe contributes something vitally necessary to him. Okay, that's an important distinction as well. Or put differently, theogenesis has two phases. Okay, God posits himself as frontal being, reflecting itself, self-sufficient upon itself. Right, say that 10 times fast. And two, that God envelops himself in particular being by essentially evolutionary unification with multiplicity. Now, for Whitehead, it's quite clear that, as with every occasion, God too is dipolar. So the primordial nature of God as the conceptual pole is the absolute wealth, he says, of potentiality, of infinite possibility. And in this pole, God is this lure, this urge of desire. And notice here the connection between the attraction and consistence that Teilhard speaks of in this urge of desire for Whitehead. Okay, but in addition to being primordial, God is also consequent. God is the beginning and the end. And as consequent, God is incorporating the creative advance of the world at every moment. As Whitehead says here, the consequent nature of God evolves in its relationships to the evolving world. But again, there's been some confusion. Whitehead's not talking about two different gods, two different separate domains. He says only the union of primordial and consequent forms a distinct entity. Right? God is a dipolar union of primordial and consequent natures. I won't read this. This is just to say that scholars have drawn connection between Teilhard and Whitehead with respect to alpha and omega and primordial and consequent natures. Ian Barber there in his early article, John Hott recently in his book speaking about the eternal ground of possibilities on the one hand and the preservation of all the events that make up the cosmic process. So Whiteheadians could say essentially the same thing. Let me draw to a close by just doing a couple comments here on evolution, providence, and love. So Teilhard says we should be able to discern, in some sense, extra human energy of a personal kind. A great presence should be discerned in evolution. Okay, not just something is emerging, but someone. Evolution is doubling back on someone. He speaks of God as providence, okay, directing the universe with loving, watchful care. And he says love is undoubtedly the single higher form towards which all spiritual energy, spiritual evolution is moving. He says in a universe as ours, where it seems to be that things are happening, connecting on this plane of union, we can speak of love in that context. So there's someone in evolution. What about for Whitehead? Well, he talks about the intuition of immediate occasions with respect to this greater and lesser achievement of ideals, right? He speaks of this as an intuition of character, somewhat like we'd intuit the characters of our friends. But in this case, it's a character permanently inherent in the nature of things. It's less personalistic. He says, this is from Religion in the Making, he says we don't intuit a character, or don't intuit a person, we infer a person from a revelation of character in some sense. It's a complication there. He also speaks of the love of God for the world as a particular providence for particular occasions, and similar to Teilhard's loving, watchful care, that God is the great companion and the fellow sufferer who understands, or that God dwells upon the tender elements which slowly and in quietness operate by love. So let me ask one final question. What are the implications of divine providential love beyond earth? Okay, that's a very large question. We could go lots of places. I think it's something like this for both of them. Okay, if you look into that magnitude, you see multiplicity, you see plenitude, you see pleroma, this drive for God to be all in all. And it belongs even to the classical tradition to say that goodness or love necessarily self-diffuses, necessarily gives of itself. And I think theologians should take note on that when they're trying to justify a plurality of worlds, this deep axiological dimension. I'll stop there. Thank you. Matt's got it, actually.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, I'll handle the mic, so whoever has questions, please.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation. I wanted to, I can't wait to read the book too. It's really fantastic. I wanted to ask about posthumanism. Exo-theology, we kind of naturally, and even in the presentation, we're talking about beyond Earth, extraterrestrials, other life. But in Ilya's presentation last night, there was a quote from Teilhard about the ultra-human. And a couple points over the past day or so, the question about the dinosaurs has been raised, the Cambrian explosion. I also have been thinking about how for 1 billion years, single cellular life breathed and died into the oceans and changed the chemical composition that made it possible for multicellular life to exist. And so there's a function in evolution in which we are potentially through our death participating in the creation of an ecosystem out of which something else can emerge. And so I'm wondering as we think about posthumanism and maybe contend for what it is supposed to mean and whether it's a positive or a negative thing, is there a dimension of Teilhard's vision that allows for the fact that what's evolving will not necessarily bring humanity with it, that there is a function of the human in the cosmos to lead to something else other?
Yeah, that's a great question. The posthumanist discussion is challenging and very, very diverse, and perspectives are all over the place. I will say that in the recent conference that Ilya and I attended a year or so ago, Noreen Hirschfield, right? She raised this question of artificial intelligence as the means through which we will travel these distances, right? So this is one part of it. We become post-human to the extent that we rely on modes of intelligence and machinery that can do what we cannot in any conceivable way. So I think the AI discussion with respect to extraterrestrial life is also quite interesting. There's a couple chapters on that in the book. Teilhard leaves the space open for that. I think of Ilya, your book recently, okay, AI and religion, right? There's definitely room for discussing that. I do think some of the post-humanist discussion jumps the gun too quickly, as if we know what it is to be human yet. Okay, are we ready to be post-human when we're not quite sure what that means yet? That's my initial reaction. So yeah, I fully agree. We need to be thinking through that. Teilhard opens up, I think, more spaces arguably than Whitehead does. There's been some interest of late of AI and Whitehead's thought. It's, I think, in its infancy. And so perhaps another conference around that topic. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Carl. Wonderful presentation. Thanks very much. I'd like to make just a comment. I don't actually have a question. Maybe you could comment on my comment, if you will. And that is, my comment is basically that the cosmos is alive. It's not as if there was life on this planet, on some galaxy, some distant place, but rather that the cosmos itself as a whole is alive. And so that perhaps in some sense, and I really don't mean to put this negatively at all, but in some sense, it doesn't make, maybe it's not as helpful to say, oh, let's look for life on such and such a planet, on such and such a galaxy. I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, is quite interesting. It's a passive approach. We're listening. Anyone out there? METI, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, takes an active approach, right? They're involved in actually sending signals to try to discern if intelligence comparable to ours can discern it in some way. So I think, absolutely, what I'm claiming is that they're living ontologies for Whitehead and Teilhard. In a sense, you can say the universe is alive with finite life. It's happening, it's perishing. We're seeking life comparable to ours to see if we can share experience domains of extraterrestrial commonality. That's a large part of the discussion. John Cobb and Charles Birch long ago wrote a great book, The Liberation of Life, in which they discuss some dimensions of life beyond Earth, and they just simply speak of God as capital L life, the life of the universe. So there's different distinctions there. If you do read Metaphysics of Exo-Life, look at the appendix. I do a whole history of process theology and extraterrestrial life, which is quite interesting, and uncovered a lot of interesting statements. I thank Don, too, for a lot of those statements. Appendix B is a republication of Lewis Ford's 1968 article, right? Presumably in view of the moon landing, called Theological Reflections on Extraterrestrial Life. It's the first sustained article on the topic, showing clear influence of Whitehead. He doesn't ever mention Whitehead. You know who he does mention? Teilhard. At the very end, speculating about the convergence of extraterrestrial world civilizations. So I want to be mindful of time here, though. So thank you for that.
I think that's it.
We'll continue the conversation. Thank you very much.